So this is a report from the CATIE Learning Institute, and what we're doing is we're looking at the entire conference through the perspective of both languages. So if you could, if those who need their headsets, if you could go and get those. And we're also looking at all the tracks from the conference. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, I guess that's up to me. Okay, so I'd like to just give you a little overview of the CATIE Learning Institute model. So CATIE has invited 5 assistant rapporteurs from all of the regions of Canada, so from BC to the Atlantic, to attend the conference and to report as assistant rapporteurs. This year, we also worked with CAHR's community scholars who were awarded scholarships to attend CAHR from across the country. So we had almost 30 people who were working to cover the conference, following all the conference tracks, and they were given support from the CATIE regional health educators, as well as from a number of very kind basic science researchers. We held an orientation meeting on the first day of CAHR, and then we held nightly debriefs and discussions where we synthesized the information from all the tracks at CAHR and distilled the main messages that we're going to be presenting to you today. So here we are at the Community Rapporteur session. After the rapporteurs leave and go back to their home communities and their home organizations, CATIE will organize dissemination activities in the form of newsletters, webinars, and workshops. So the first track that we're going to hear from, and I'd like to invite Heidi Exner to come up, is the basic science track. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. It's actually the Francophone presentation. So Marc Leclerc.
Bonjour tout le monde, mon nom est Marc Leclerc et c'est un grand privilège de faire partie de l'équipe des rapporteurs de CATIE. C'est intéressant parce que on peut acquérir de l'information, mais également en termes d'expérience, on a un survol des différents secteurs des présentations. Et nous, l'équipe des rapporteurs du Québec, nous avons été sous l'impression, en fait, on nous a demandé de présenter vraiment d'une façon encore plus large, c'est-à-dire en survol, les différents secteurs que mes collègues ici vont vous présenter un peu plus tard. Une phrase, en fait, une phrase qui nous a particulièrement inspiré d'appliquer le survol à toutes les données, à toutes les présentations. C'est au cours de la présentation de Bruno Spire, la question de repérer, tester, traiter et fidéliser. C'est un principe qui peut également s'appliquer à l'intérieur de toutes les sphères des démarches dans la recherche, autant que dans les soins, les traitements et le suivi, et auprès des organisations communautaires. Alors, repérer ce qu'on appelle SIC, les points principaux, donc diversifier les stratégies de prévention. Il y a des programmes, par exemple, qui sont à identifier de façon plus précise les clientèles ou encore le mode de fonctionnement. Dans le cas de STOP en Colombie-Britannique, évidemment, les objectifs susciter l'intérêt des gens à se faire dépister, dépistage par des agents communautaires et des pairs en termes de meilleure intégration de tous les agents, mise à place des moyens incitatifs encourageant le dépistage et son suivi, et évidemment une nouvelle notion qui est très populaire auprès des gens. On demande un résultat rapide en 60 secondes, le Know in 60 seconds. Tester, test. On donne l'exemple du projet SPOT au Québec ici, qui offre des tests rapides et anonymes et un counseling auprès de la clientèle des ARSA, donc MSM en anglais, en combinant dépistage et un suivi. Il est intéressant aussi d'impliquer des notions de rétention de ces gens-là qui vont à ce centre-là. C'est donc évidemment tester aussi des notions de tester à l'extérieur d'un milieu clinique, donc hors laboratoire, pour faciliter encore plus l'accès dans les populations. Et ça, c'est vraiment non seulement ici au Canada, mais un peu partout dans le monde. Tester pour avoir une participation accrue des communautés dans les nouvelles stratégies et méthodes de dépistage plus efficaces, plus accessibles. Traiter, treat. Quand débuter le traitement, de quelque façon que ce soit. Alors, en termes de clinique, charge virale, CD4, diminuer la charge virale communautaire, les notions de transmission des virus résistants qui sont vraiment il faut en tenir compte. Trouver la bonne combinaison antirétrovirale selon le besoin. Encore là, selon le besoin, hein, ici en Afrique, ici au Canada, un peu partout, pour avoir une meilleure efficacité. Fidéliser, retain, ça c'est un principe encore plus important. C'est dur d'expliquer tout ça, mais disons que fidéliser sous un aspect de suivi médical ou encore psychosocial, c'est important. En termes de fidélisation, évidemment, en termes de dépistage, la fidélisation est importante à une ou plusieurs étapes du procédé. Donc, développer l'envie de se faire dépister. On a dit au cours de la conférence, dans plusieurs aspects, qu'il fallait augmenter, évidemment, le dépistage. Il faut dépister plus de personnes. Dans les constats, évidemment, les perceptions, dans la recherche, par exemple, les perceptions erronées de la population sur le VIH, on a encore, en 2012, évidemment, l'expression de peur irrationnelle chez l'ensemble de la population. Et ça, encore là, si on fouille, on parle de problématiques ou de peurs sous-jacentes. Et c'est bien sûr évidemment relié à tout l'aspect de la sérophobie qui est présente au sein de la population en général. Puis quand on dit dans certaines communautés, c'est des sous-groupes ou des sous-aspects de sérophobie. Quand on parle par exemple dans la communauté homosexuelle, gay, évidemment la sérophobie est aussi un phénomène observé qui est très important. Les défis, évidemment, Bruno Spire et d'autres collègues l'ont dit, le dépistage, encore là, il le faut. Quand on disait test and treat, je pense que la phrase, en fait, ce que disait Monsieur Dr. Spire, il faut aller plus loin que tester et dépister. Il faut vraiment avoir une approche beaucoup plus globale pour viser l'efficacité et évidemment l'éradication de l'épidémie. Il faut faire reculer absolument la sérophobie pour plusieurs raisons. Le soutien des PVVIH, les personnes atteintes, là, il ne faut jamais les oublier dans quelque processus que ce soit. Il faut encore plus pousser la compréhension de leur réalité en intégrant, en consultant les communautés, mais aussi les groupes communautaires VIH-Sida dans le processus de recherche, mais aussi dans les processus d'application, bien sûr. Perspective, évidemment, un rôle accru des acteurs communautaires, mais en intégrant tout le processus au niveau clinique, recherche, etc. La bonification des traitements, l'amélioration des politiques et des interventions, encore là, que ce soit au niveau du financement ou encore des mises en application des programmes. Continuer la recherche pour un vaccin, ça on le dira encore que c'est bien beau les traitements, mais un vaccin pourrait être à la première page. Voilà, c'est fini. Merci beaucoup.
So now I'd like to present Heidi Exner, who's going to present on the basic science track. And we had really great support and great enthusiasm from her as the rapporteur for this very difficult track for community people to follow.
Good morning, everyone. So I want to preface this by saying I'm not a basic scientist. I'm a community educator. So what I tried to do in league with my colleagues, thank goodness they were there, as well as the basic scientists, is try and sum up some of the basic science tracks in plain language to understand what everything was talking about in terms of themes, everyone said. So what everyone said here. So here we go. Good luck. So the first track was on HIV cell structure, function, and cell biology, so basically how it works. HIV is a master manipulator. I like to call it the devil, because it just takes everything and manipulates it for its own needs and totally changes the whole immune response and takes advantage of it. So it co-opts natural cell function to help itself spread and replicate. So how do we mess with this system of the HIV's ability to manipulate us? We can destabilize this delicate GP120, GP40 receptor site. That's the receptor site on the outside of the cell that allows it to actually fuse to CD4 cells. So we can mess with that system because it's actually not that strong. We can interrupt its quality control mechanisms for viral RNA production, how it splices up the RNA it produces from our cells to make more of itself. We can mess with that system. We can interrupt its timing and how it does that, and how it exports new RNA out of our nuclei in our CD4 cells to make more of itself. We can also maintain and reestablish the natural CD4 antiviral activity, because I didn't know this when I first got here, which is amazing, that our CD4 cells have their own antivirals that they create in response to the virus. HIV is just really good at shutting those down. So how do we protect the cell's production of stress granules, which is one of the response, and therefore its own RNA processes? So those are things that would normally keep going to recreate the cell, keep the CD4s working, but HIV kind of co-opts those systems and shuts them down for its own use. The second track was on innate and adaptive immune responses to HIV. So innate are the older kind of immediate responses in the body to the any kind of virus or bacteria or anything in the body, a foreign kind of invader. And so it's the first response. It's very important. And adaptive immune response is the more specific response that the body develops over time. So it will be more functional in chronic infection. So how do our innate and adaptive responses to HIV what was talked about at the basic science tracks? Here's what I got out of it and what our group got out of it. So HIV uses our body's immune responses, especially inflammation, against us. So we've heard a lot about inflammation at this conference and before. How do we take our fight back is what I kind of got from some of the science. So we can study the innate immune system responses to HIV. So the early response is actually very important because it helps to kind of keep HIV from getting very far in our body. Natural killer cells are one of the first responses in general response to the virus. It's one of the first things that's going to kind of identify an attack. So some of these natural killer cells have receptor site mutations that can keep the natural killer cell functioning against HIV during the acute early phase. Whereas HIV would find a way to kind of shut that down, some killer cells and some folks have mutations that we can kind of try and learn from and see how we can keep other people's natural killer cells functioning. We've heard a lot about mucosal integrity at this conference, specifically in the female genital tract. Well, there was some science on how the intestine mucosal integrity is very important because one of the major seats of the immune system is in the intestines. So how do we find a way to protect? There's some delicate cells called the Th17 cells in the intestinal mucous membrane, and how do we keep them working? Because some of them really die off at the beginning, in the beginning of an infection, but some survive. So some of the science was looking at why do some of them survive, and how do we kind of keep them going? Breast milk for mother-to-child transmission was talked about. How do we learn more about its natural anti-inflammatory STLR2 qualities? So that STLR2 innate factor in breast milk is what offers protection to infants, because it's one of those innate first responses that's in breast milk that kind of generally attacks any foreign stuff that shouldn't be there, and it gets conferred to the infant through breastfeeding. So how do we keep that rolling and also study that for other innate responses? I think that was very interesting. And then finally, there was a study on saliva, understanding how something called a proline-rich protein 2 that's in saliva inhibits HIV. Again, it's an innate response, so it's one of the first responses. The interesting thing about that, I think, and one of the things that the presenter talked about was, well, if it works in saliva, why can't we look at that in a way to kind of create a microbicide out of that can work on any mucosal surface? So that was very interesting stuff. The third track was on antiretrovirals, microbicides, and vaccines. So again, a lot of this is about how do we help our own body do its job. So how do we enhance our external medical interventions to help the body in its immune response? So someone looked at protease inhibition and targeted, it was kind of talked about in the study that there are 12 different places that the protease enzymes cut up new viral RNA so that it's functional, so it can actually butt off and do its job to infect other cells. Well, there's 12 different spots along that kind of viral splicing event that we can kind of target to help stop how it is able to cut itself up and butt off as viable virus. So targeting those 12 spots that HIV needs to cleave can help stop viable virus production. Intestinal processing. So understanding how some of the medications interact with each other in the intestine and with intestinal wall proteins helps us understand how to block or enhance drug metabolism so it's actually more effective, because sometimes the drugs don't actually get to where they need to go in the high enough concentrations to be effective, and intestinal cell proteins have a role in that. So some of the science talked about that, which was very interesting. And then there was mucosal vaccines. So one of the keynotes on the vaginal cell wall and how it produces mucus that helps defend against HIV, and actually was really effective at doing that. Mucosal vaccines were talked about a lot, I think, and the creation of broadly neutralizing antibody vaccines to help stop the virus and protect the mucous membrane was also repeated in some of these sessions. So broadly neutralizing meaning that we don't have to always stop how the virus gets through the whole body in its tracks. Maybe all we need to do is find a way to keep the mucous membranes, which is where usually HIV is coming into the body, through the anus, through the vagina. How do we stop it at that place, or even slow it down so that the body has time to respond effectively and naturally as it normally would? And finally, the pathogenesis, or the lifespan of HIV infection and co-infection in the body. So this is over the long term. I had to sum this all up by saying a lot of it had to do with how HIV uses inflammation to not only get in the body and use our body against itself to spread, but also keep itself going. So it continues to shut off trigger the inflammatory response over time. So what are some of the clues to how this functions in chronic infection? Well, one of the very interesting talks that a lot of us were quite intrigued by was the role of female sex hormones in this. So progesterone in this study can be shown to be pro-inflammatory, which can increase HIV's ability to permeate the female genital tract. So that was kind of interesting and has implications for things like birth control and also other kinds of microbicidal or protective factors for women. The GP120 of HIV also can induce inflammatory response in the body over time. So finding ways, again, GP120 as the receptor site on the HIV virus was talked about in other studies at the conference. So again, the receptor site on the virus itself, it's neat to see that there's more science being aimed at kind of how that virus can even fuse with the cell and what it does in other parts of the immune system. And then there was a bit of information on elite controllers, so people that are able to control the virus over the long term and just not progress or not get infected despite repeated exposures. So the mutations on the surface of their CD4 cells seem to not only sometimes inhibit infection, but also inhibit inflammatory response as a result. So there's a relationship there. So is that 5 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So there you go. Tried to sum it up in as general terms as I could. Really thank the basic scientists for helping our team on this. I learned a huge amount, and I have a newfound respect for how science is involved in helping keep this going, keep this fight going, and keep us finding new ways to get around HIV and take our fight back. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Heidi. I'd like to now introduce Thomas Egdorf, who's going to take us through the clinical sciences track.
So there was ongoing research on neurocognitive issues in PHAs, identified a need for third-party history, is there a role for service providers, there was shown a need for brief, easy-to-administer tools. When to start treatment continues to be a question. In acute affection, greater than 500 CD4s, greater than 350 CD4s. Consensus is moving towards early treatment for prevention and treatment benefits. But questions remain about viral levels in genital tract in relation to transmission. Drug resistance emerging in clusters was observed in both urban Montreal MSM and rural settings in Northern Ontario injection drug users. Effectiveness of multidisciplinary approaches, particularly in smoking cessation, as well as in HCV treatment in injection drug users. And that was really looking at including psychology as well, working with people with depression. It was really showing that when you address depression, there's a greater likelihood of people remaining non-smoking. Need for increased access to HCV treatment. Only 20% of treating physicians feel comfortable treating injection drug users. And the revision of the Canadian guidelines, treatment for injection drug users will be considered under any circumstances, is the term they were looking to include. Increased monitoring for renal toxicity in patients on tenofovir is recommended. The Canadian guidelines to be set at CAHR. There was general consensus on one type of the test, but a difference between U.S. and European opinions on the frequency of another test. There's a new era of treatment with minimal interruption into patients' lives, looking often now treatment is failing not because of virological failure, but because of adherence issues with people taking the medications. The HPV quad vaccine looks safe and effective in HIV-positive girls and women. There still needs to be research on its effectiveness in boys and men, particularly in the MSM community. And my personal favorite, there was a study looking at the impact of smoking joints on liver fibrosis. And what was actually found is 1 to 2 joints per day has a protective factor on liver fibrosis. That's my main takeaway for the conference. Thank you.
When Thomas and I were working on the slides last night, we considered just one slide that said marijuana good. I'd like to now introduce, Floyd Visser, who's going to take us through the public health and epidemiology track.
Good morning, everyone. So our group actually came up with 3 key trends or themes in the sessions that we saw. The first one, and most importantly, was the testing, and bringing testing to community events and making it approachable. And there was a fantastic presentation from the Vancouver East Side, in where they had almost like testing fairs and bringing people together and celebrating good health, I think, is what we kind of got from this, and bringing where it was okay to be tested, and it was actually a good thing to be there and to enjoy. It was also all about creating quick and easy links to care and support. So when we talked, for instance, about the East Side Vancouver fairs that they had, is that they were able to link all the people who were being tested positive to care within 24 hours. Very important. And the ability to follow up with people was great. The other key theme that we picked up throughout all the presentations is the importance of involving peers in the testing. And we saw that in terms of the study in Montreal around possibly having a safe injection site, and the fact that 78% of the individuals who responded to the survey said that they would be comfortable with a peer worker. And of course, we saw very similar and very high results coming from other centers here in Canada. So, there we go. Second key trend or key theme was messaging. We need to learn to become more creative about how we're reaching out to people. We need to continue to explore online social media and phone applications as effective prevention and education methods. However, we also learned that this is not a standalone. In other words, let's not drop all the work that we do within the community, at bars, in parks, or wherever we may be doing our work, but to actually begin integrating our social media with that. So we're really looking at things like phone applications. One of the discussions that we were having yesterday is actually how many young people are actually using computers these days as frequently as they're using the apps on their telephone to find out about events in the community and things that are happening and things that are important to them. And the third theme that we came up with, it was around the men who have sex with men. And we're still seeing disproportionately high numbers of positive HIV tests or transmissions among MSM groups. And particularly around men under 30 are showing high rates of syphilis infection and reinfection. And so what are we doing about this? And it was interesting that we noted one of the abstracts in terms of how the focus on MSM has not been as great even here at CAHR in the last few presentations. And yet this is a really important group to get to. And the connection to this community needs to be creative. And we already talked a little bit about the messaging that's been going on. Because as we're finding out is that the MSM community is very decentralized and has become much more decentralized with online applications. So we have to, again, be creative in terms of how we get to this group, but we also need to be giving some very specific messages to the MSM group and developing some very targeted marketing campaigns and social media campaigns to this particular group. I think that was it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Floyd. And finally, I'd like to ask Mike Cecilio to come up, and he's going to present on the social sciences track.
Hi, everyone. So we've been presented with some really interesting research from the social sciences over the last few days. So some of the research that has come through has been on the impacts of criminalization of HIV non-disclosure, also Canadian attitudes towards HIV and people living with HIV and AIDS. There's also been research on food and housing security, impacts of power inequities and intimate partner violence on risk of transmission, and also the evaluation of various programs such as SPOT and also pouvoir partager. So what my group wanted to do was to really distill a lot of the really disparate and diverse research and to come up with a few high-level themes, and this is what we've come up with. So a lot of the social science research that we've been presented with, and perhaps by its very nature, is that it is quite complex. So when looking at risk factors, there are many dimensions and a lot of different sort of factors, and it makes drawing conclusions quite grey, and often it raises more questions than it does actually providing answers. And what we've found is that it often raises more questions for further research. So when conclusions are being drawn, there is this value that we're finding from the social science research that it does come from a holistic perspective, looking at psychosocial, emotional, environmental, as well as behavioral sort of factors. So, just to provide a few examples, Kathleen Deering's presentation on sex workers in BC around the pressures and demands for client non-condom use presented that it was a multidimensional landscape and that there are complex factors that contribute to that, such as substance consumption, such as a history of sexual and physical violence, and the economic pressures as well from demands from clients to actually offer more money for non-condom use. And Putu Duff took it a bit further with by looking at the stolen generations and Aboriginal sex workers, and looking at the legacy of colonization and how high rates of child apprehension and also having a history of being apprehended as a child contributes to HIV risk factors as well. Olivier Fellat, in his presentation on syndemics among young Canadian gay men, also and I apologize, I'm talking about complexity, but I feel like I'm oversimplifying a lot of this research. But presented multidimensional factors as to why MSM are facing risk of HIV transmission, and looked at marginalization, looked at less knowledge around sexual health behaviors, and also the intersectionality of systems of oppression. So looking really at environmental factors and looking at the public at large, looking at heterosexism, and to complexify or complicate matters even further, it was broken down by age group, and finding that the age group from born 1980 to 89 actually presented with the highest risk of HIV transmission among all other age groups. So that was really interesting and pertinent to know. And also that prevention does need to look at needs to look broader than just simply looking at sexual risk, also needing to look at stigma and other health and personal concerns as well. Okay, so the next theme, something that came through as well from a lot of the research is that there seems to be this call for greater participant involvement in every stage of the research. And one really powerful example was actually Wangari's presentation looking at the relationship between women living with HIV and researchers. And there was this presentation that there are power dynamics involved, and this mistrust of research by those being researched on. So in this example, women living with HIV, speaking of exploitation and speaking of tokenization. And so there was this call for greater peer-based research and also knowledge dissemination as a means for greater community engagement. The presentation by Jessica Yee and Erin Cosmo on Aboriginal youth decolonizing HIV prevention, which was a community-based research conducted by Aboriginal youths. That also called for a greater engagement of Aboriginal youths in determining their own health outcomes and to be involved in the research itself, and also called for authorities to actually stop othering and referring to at-risk groups without actually taking accountability themselves. Another really good presentation on this topic was the operationalizing qualitative research in resource-poor settings by Stephanie Nixon, and it looked at conducting research in Zambia. And there was this real emphasis to get together a broad and diverse fieldwork team in order to get the right partners who may not necessarily have experience or background or who have studied in research. And there was this emphasis to then train those community volunteers later in research, and to recruit people from all walks of life. For example, she was citing the recruitment of deaf or hard of hearing HIV participants to actually interview other deaf or hard of hearing HIV positive participants in that particular research study. So the one big takeaway that I personally got from this is that the community wants knowledge and tools that we can use and adapt in our lives. So, and particularly from the perspective of community workers, we want to engage more with researchers in order to develop practical programs for the populations that we're actually working with. So we want to know how we can apply research on the field, and we want to know where the gaps are in order to address them better with our communities, and also to be empowered with the knowledge so that we can engage our communities a lot better as well. So thank you.
So that's a whirlwind trip through the conference, and I'd just like to give a lot of thanks to all of the people that were involved in the Learning Institute.
And on behalf of the CAHR organization, I just would like to congratulate CATIE for the great job that you did with the CATIE Learning Institute and the very remarkable quality of your work. So I just want to offer a little bit. Thank you. And I invite Jean-Pierre to introduce the speaker for the closing plenary.
Alors merci au groupe de CATIE de ce survol extraordinaire sur les 4 tracks et qui met aussi des perspectives et qui va dessiner un peu le programme de CAHR 2013. For the closing plenary, we wanted to put focus on jail and prison, and that's on behalf of Bill Cameron, who was a former CAHR president, and last year he evoked this theme as a core problem for increasing HIV transmission. So we wanted this year for this CAHR meeting to have a special session on HIV and correction, and on, I think, the spirited vision of Bill Cameron. I'm very pleased to invite the panel to come on stage, and to Dr. Peter Ford, Emeritus Professor of Medicine at Queen's University and physician doing HIV medicine at Kensington General Hospital, who works for more than 3 decades in prison and jail in Canada. So thank you, and I invite all the panel to join on stage. Thank you.
Actually, probably the panel would be